In 1965, when Harlem was a war zone of power plays, broken promises, and the constant tug of war between loyalty and betrayal, Tony "Big Man" DeMarco made a decision that would seal his fate. He thought his bond with Bumpy Johnson, his best friend and confidant, was unbreakable. What he didn't know was that the same streets he had walked alongside Bumpy for years were about to turn on him, and in just 7 days, his life would be nothing but a memory. Tony believed the $50,000 would solve all his problems, but in the end, it led to a fate far worse than death. Tony DeMarco was more than just Bumpy Johnson's best friend. He was his right-hand man. He had been with Bumpy through thick and thin, from the tough neighborhoods of Harlem to the back rooms of the city's most powerful figures. A tall, stocky man with a rough exterior, Tony had always carried himself with confidence, often seen as the quiet strength behind Bumpy's more public persona. His loyalty to Bumpy was unwavering. At least, that's what everyone thought. But beneath the surface, there was greed. It wasn't that Tony didn't respect Bumpy. He did, deeply. But there were moments when the hunger for wealth and power gnawed at him. When the opportunity arose to make a quick $50,000 through a shady deal with an outside syndicate, Tony saw it as a way to secure his future. What he didn't count on was the betrayal that would follow. Tony had always prided himself on being untouchable. His role as Bumpy's best friend had earned him respect, but it also made him feel invincible. He believed his position in Harlem's underworld was unshakable, and no one, not even Bumpy, would question his loyalty. Little did he know, his betrayal would not only destroy his friendship with Bumpy, it would bring him face to face with a reckoning he couldn't escape. Tony's betrayal wasn't just about money. It was about breaking the most sacred rule in Bumpy Johnson's world: respect. For Bumpy, loyalty wasn't just an agreement. It was a bond that couldn't be fractured. To betray him was to betray the very streets that had given both men their power. And once that trust was broken, there was no coming back. Bumpy had built his empire not just on money, but on respect. The streets of Harlem were his kingdom, and anyone who crossed that line would feel the consequences. Tony didn't just jeopardize their friendship, he threatened the entire order of Bumpy's world. The $50,000 he had taken from the syndicate was more than just a bribe. It was a challenge to Bumpy's rule. The betrayal was a moral violation that demanded justice. It wasn't about punishing Tony for being greedy. It was about reminding everyone that in Harlem, no one was untouchable, not even Bumpy's closest friends. The stage was set. The trap had been laid. It was only a matter of time before Bumpy would confront his former friend, and when that moment came, Tony would wish he had never crossed that line. It started when Tony received the call from the syndicate. The deal was simple: $50,000 in exchange for looking the other way on a shipment of illegal goods coming into the city. Tony was in no position to refuse. It was an offer too good to pass up. He figured it was a one-time thing, a way to secure his financial future. What he didn't realize was that by accepting the deal, he was digging his own grave. The opportunity presented itself at a low-key meeting in the back room of a small speakeasy. Tony sat across from the syndicate's men, his mind racing with the possibilities that the money could bring. But what he didn't know was that his every move was being watched. Bumpy had learned about the deal, and he wasn't happy. Tony's attempt to keep it a secret from him had already put him on Bumpy's radar. Bumpy didn't need to rush in, guns blazing. He wasn't that kind of man. He knew the value of patience. He let Tony think he had gotten away with it, letting him believe the deal was in the bag. But what Tony didn't know was that Bumpy was setting a trap, psychological warfare of the highest order. Bumpy's reaction was measured, calm. He had a way of absorbing the sting of betrayal and using it to fuel his next move. When he found out about the $50,000 deal, he didn't rush to confront Tony. He took a step back, watching, listening, calculating. He wasn't angry. He was disappointed, which to Bumpy was the most devastating thing of all. This wasn't about the money. This was about loyalty, respect, and the broken bond between two men who had once been brothers. Bumpy wasn't going to punish Tony in a way that would be quick or easy. No, he had something more profound in mind, a lesson that Tony would never forget. Bumpy's calm reaction contrasted with the storm brewing inside him. He knew Tony had to be made to understand the gravity of his actions. But Bumpy wouldn't show his hand, not yet. He would wait, letting Tony think he had gotten away with it, letting him believe his betrayal would go unpunished. Tony felt secure. He thought the deal was finished, that the money was his, and there would be no consequences. He saw no reason to worry. After all, Bumpy had always had his back. But he had forgotten one crucial thing. In Harlem, respect was everything. And when you broke the code, you didn't just risk your life, you risked your legacy. What Tony didn't know was that Bumpy was already preparing. He was setting things in motion, pulling strings that Tony wouldn't even be aware of until it was too late. Bumpy's men began to make subtle moves. People close to Tony started to look at him differently, sensing the change in the air. The tension was rising, and Tony was blind to it. While Tony relaxed, thinking he had outsmarted Bumpy, Bumpy was already 2 steps ahead. The trap was set, and it wouldn't be long before the moment of reckoning arrived. Bumpy's preparation was nothing short of meticulous. He understood that Tony's arrogance would be his downfall, so Bumpy didn't just rush into an act of violence or retribution. Instead, he planned a psychological trap, one that would make Tony realize the full weight of his betrayal in the most profound way possible. The first step was to isolate Tony. Bumpy's men subtly cut off his connections, letting the paranoia seep in. The people Tony had once trusted began to turn their backs, the streets suddenly quiet, the familiar faces missing. Bumpy made sure that the walls would close in on Tony without him even knowing who was doing the closing. In the silence, Tony's anxiety grew. He could feel the weight of his betrayal starting to take its toll. Meanwhile, Bumpy worked in the shadows, manipulating the narrative and ensuring that Tony had no escape. He let Tony believe that the $50,000 deal had been a smart move, that he was getting away with it, that he could maintain his control. But Bumpy knew better. Tony had broken an unspoken rule, one that had far greater consequences than any sum of money. And then, just as Tony's confidence reached its peak, Bumpy struck. The moment arrived when Tony least expected it. It was 7:00 p.m., the kind of cold autumn evening when the air felt like it held a secret, waiting to be told. Tony had just returned from another business meeting, the weight of his actions still heavy but hidden beneath the surface. He walked down the familiar streets of Harlem, unaware that the game was over. As he approached a familiar alleyway, the sense of unease he'd been ignoring for days began to crawl up his spine. Without warning, a figure stepped out of the shadows. A familiar face, but not one Tony had expected to see in this context. "Bumpy," Tony said, his voice barely a whisper, recognizing the man who had been his friend for years. "What is this? What do you want?" Bumpy's gaze was calm, unflinching. "I want you to understand something, Tony. You think money can solve your problems, but money don't buy loyalty. It don't buy respect." Tony froze, confusion and fear mixing in his chest. What are you talking about? You sold me out for 50 grand, Tony. For 50,000, you threw away everything we built. But the price you pay for that betrayal, it's not just about the money. It's about what you lost when you turned your back on me. Bumpy's voice was low, measured, carrying the weight of years of experience. It wasn't a threat. It was a statement of undeniable fact. Tony began to sweat, his heart racing. Bumpy, I'm going to tell you something once, Tony, Bumpy continued, his voice still calm but filled with the power of a man who knew what was coming. You're going to spend the next 7 days thinking you've gotten away with this. You'll walk around thinking you're free, thinking you can escape the consequences of what you did. But when the 7 days are up, when that clock runs out, you'll be in a place where no one can help you, no one will find you. You'll be sitting in your own grave. Tony's eyes widened as the full weight of Bumpy's words hit him. He tried to move, to speak, but his legs felt like lead, and his throat was dry. He wanted to deny it, to convince himself this was just a bad dream. But there was something in Bumpy's eyes, a finality, a certainty that he couldn't escape. The 7 days were filled with dread and paranoia for Tony. He went through the motions, but the tension in his chest never eased. Every corner he turned, every step he took, he felt eyes watching him. The streets he once owned now felt like a maze, the walls closing in. His phone calls were answered with silence, his old allies nowhere to be found. He knew Bumpy had set the trap, and now he was waiting for the inevitable. On the 7th day, Tony found himself in a place he never imagined, the empty alleyway where Bumpy had confronted him. It felt like a death sentence, the air thick with the smell of damp concrete and the weight of the past. He didn't know how he'd gotten there, but he was standing at the edge of his fate. There was no way out, no escape. And then, as if from nowhere, the police arrived. They found him sitting, his body slumped, his expression frozen in fear. But it wasn't the way they expected to find him. Tony was sitting in his own grave, the dirt piled high around him, his arms bound in a final, humiliating gesture. He had been left with nothing. His wealth, his power, his friendships, all turned to dust. The symbolism was clear. Tony's life had been a shallow game of power and betrayal, and in the end, he was nothing more than a man undone by his own greed. His death wasn't violent, it was psychological. A man trapped in the cage of his own choices, forced to confront the consequences of his actions in the most haunting way. The police tried to make sense of what had happened, but the community of Harlem knew better. Word spread quickly that Bumpy Johnson had delivered a message, not just to Tony, but to everyone who might think they could get away with betrayal. Tony's name was never spoken again in Harlem. His reputation was wiped from the streets, replaced by whispers of his fate. Bumpy's legend grew even larger, his code of loyalty and respect cemented in the hearts of those who walked the streets he protected. Bumpy's justice wasn't just about punishment. It was about making sure that the lessons of betrayal would never be forgotten. And as for Tony, his death was a reminder to all who crossed the line. In Harlem, there was no escape from the consequences of disrespect. If this story hit you, smash that subscribe button. We're telling the Bumpy Johnson story's history forgot, the moments that made him a legend, the code that made him untouchable. Drop a like if you think Bumpy was the smartest man in Harlem. And in the comments, what would you have done if you were Tony DeMarco? More legendary stories coming next day. Don't miss it.